Hello, Electorette listeners. This is Jen Taylor Skinner, the host and creator of the Electorette. I just want to take a moment to congratulate you because you are about to enjoy another episode of the Electorette, featuring an interview with yet another brilliant woman. And if you're enjoying the Electorette and you want to support the women whose work we elevate, the activists, the writers, the women who dedicate their lives and careers to bring us great literature and who make us think, and they bring about change in the world. If you want to support those women, just please take a moment and pause this episode and subscribe. When you subscribe to the Electorette, it's the best way to help us bring you more interviews like the one you're about to enjoy. And after you hit subscribe, please hurry back and hit play again, because I don't want you to miss a second of this episode. Trust me, it's a really, really good one. Enjoy! I'm Jen Taylor Skinner, and this is The Electorette. On this episode, I discuss her new book titled High Heel with author Summer Brennan.
Isn't that nice?
I just read a really beautiful book titled High Heel. It's a book from a collection by Bloomsbury, and in this collection, a writer will explore a seemingly mundane object or an event or an idea. And Summer Brennan, who's an award-winning writer and journalist, she wrote about the high heel. And before I started reading her book High Heel, I didn't really know what to expect. I mean, if you wear high heels, how much do you actually think about them beyond, how they look or how they make your legs look? Or, do they fit me or are they comfortable? But there's so much more to explore, as Summer Brennan reveals in this book. The first thing that I discovered when reading it was that this is a book that needed to be taken slowly. I had to take my time and really digest each section of the book. The book's been described as ferociously intelligent, and it really is. It's meditative and it's fun. And the book can be both these things at once because it's organized in these small sections, like these mini meditations. And each one explores the high heel with really smart analogies from mythology or fashion and literature. And with each meditation, I had to pause and consider, how that story fit into my own life and my own relationship to being a woman and my presentation as a woman and what I decide to put on my feet for that presentation. Anyhow, I really hope you enjoy this conversation with Summer Brennan. First of all, that the book is really, really beautifully written.
Oh, thank you.
I was hesitant to say this because I didn't want to come across as condescending, but it's so smart.
Okay.
It's such an intelligent book.
Thank you.
Right?
No, I think that's totally fair, though, because I know what sort of assumption leads somebody to maybe want to remark about that because of the subject matter of the book. And I have or had those kinds of assumptions, too, so don't worry about it.
No, and you're absolutely right. I mean, the way that you write about high heels, it's just the language is so elevated. You make analogies to Greek mythology, with Daphne and Apollo, and you make references to, classic literature, thinking
Right.
about your repeated references to the black patent leather heels from the bell jar.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
And you explore the symbolism of high heels, but you elevate the conversation to something, like you said, it's typically trivialized. Was that intentional on your part?
I think part of what inspired me to do it was the thought that what if someone took a subject like this very seriously? And I think it's actually a more serious issue in women's lives than is often given credit. Not just high heels, but just, the things that we put on our bodies, the things we do to our bodies in order to be seen as beautiful or even just professional or appropriate for different situations. It's true that we tend to trivialize things that are considered feminine, especially if they're beyond feminine into girly, and sort of the more so, the less serious they're seen. But, that's not the case of things that are, masculine or boyish. And so I just thought, I think there's actually a lot of really interesting intellectual depth to this subject. And so that was what I wanted to explore with my book.
Yeah. The thing is that I've taught myself to read quickly, right? I kind of have to because I, go through these books. So, but when I was reading this book, I could not read it quickly.
Oh, interesting.
Yeah. Much like high heels, the book and the way that it's written, it slows you down.
Oh, wow.
Right?
Okay. Yeah.
Because it's so cerebral. Because each little essay, like each little meditation, it leaves you with a question. It left me with a question, right? Or something to meditate on.
Yeah, no, that's interesting. I mean, I've actually heard that from a few people, which is which is surprising. I've also heard the opposite in a sense that because the sections are short, it can move quickly because you're sort of constantly moving on to the next bit. But there are a few people, especially women readers, have said that they've had to take it in pieces because of that. And I mean, I think it is very distilled. I certainly had enough material to fit into a book twice its length. And so maybe that's something to it. I mean, there's that, is it a Mark Twain quote or George Bernard Shaw or somebody that said they would have written a shorter letter if they'd had more time? And so in some ways, this is the book that I took the time to write in a more shorter form.
Yeah, and the poem in the beginning is really beautiful. Did you actually write that? It starts with a woman runs through the forest chased by a god. Is that yours?
Oh yeah, that's mine. I mean, I guess you can see it as a poem, but that was just what sort of came to me for the start of the book. So yeah, I guess it is kind of a poem, but that's me.
So I guess, one of the questions that lingered with me as I was reading through the book was, how did we convince half of our population, the most vulnerable half,
Right.
to wear something every day that makes them even more vulnerable? How did we get to that place?
Yeah, I mean, that's a very long answer, to answer that question, but it is a really interesting thing to consider. I mean, of course, I'm tempted to give you like a literal answer to how that actually happened, but of course, it's more complex than that. And high heels, I think in the last 50. I guess now we're getting on 70 years of the modern iteration of the high heel, like the tall stiletto heel with a thin heel and all that, is different from what they used to be. And I think that there used to be a little bit less difference in terms of like the shape of a man's and a woman's shoe, especially in the 18th century. And for parts of the 19th, I think women's shoes for a long time have been built out of flimsier materials. So, beginning of the 19th century, women were wearing flat shoes mostly, but they wore out very easily. They weren't necessarily as comfortable. They definitely weren't as sturdy. So there's always been, I think, some like inequality with men's and women's footwear, which, as I say in the book, I think really is about the idea of what a man and a woman, and of course this is working from, a binary, which is not really real, but you know what I mean? The ideas of what a man's supposed to do and what a woman's supposed to do in the world.
Right. So, it's interesting that you wrote the book in Paris, right? The birthplace of the stiletto. And, I have to tell you, I don't admit this very often publicly,
Sure.
But I'm a Francophile and I've always been a Francophile.
Oh, really? Okay.
Yeah. And I don't know why that embarrasses me. I just don't admit it very often. But, at least once a year, some magazine or some teen magazine comes out with a listicle about how American women can be more French.
Oh, gosh.
Right.
Yes. It's always, how to dress like a French girl, how to wear makeup like a French girl, how to not wear makeup like a French girl, date, all of it. Yeah, I know exactly what you mean.
Right. But it's never anything practical or like pragmatic. Like, to be more French, you should command that your government like mandate parental leave.
Well, this is actually what I say. None of it's real anyway. I mean, listen, I'm definitely not an expert on being French. I'm not French, but just from the, limited amounts of time I have spent there over the last decade, you pick up an idea of what people actually do with their lives. And these lists very rarely have anything to do with what people might do. And exactly as you say, I actually wanted to write like a satire article that was like how to have universal healthcare like a French girl. Because I think we also, or like, how to parent like the French, and these things are based on these larger systems and these, infrastructure and health and support in ways that we don't have in America anyways. So yes, it's a funny phenomenon, but I love France too. So I don't blame you.
Okay. So this is, now that you've said that, I don't know if my next question is, has any value, but so from my impression, French women have greater conviction around their shoes. Is that true?
Oh, I think it depends. I mean, in terms of the conviction of like dedication to a certain kind of shoe, or what do you mean?
Well, okay, so I'm remembering one listicle that I read.
Okay, yeah.
And it said that, French women, how American women, when you go to a professional environment, you're in some setting and, they have the sneakers on and their sneakers to work, but when they get there, they change into high heels. And I read that French women don't do that, right? And
yeah.
that, is that true?
Oh, I don't know. I mean, I think that you definitely, I've never noticed like on the metro in Paris, for example, a woman in office attire who's wearing running shoes. Like, I do think that there might be more of an awareness of like your style and public persona in that sense. But of course, they wear whatever. I think high heels still are the footwear, like I say in the book, of a more formal workplace or a formal, celebration or evening event, awards shows, parties, those kinds of things. But of course, they wear all kinds of different shoes, just like you.
Because they're human.
Right, exactly.
Yeah. So going back to the trivialization of things that are feminine, there's one story that I really loved in the book about a scientist.
Oh,
She
yeah.
considered herself to be a sensible person, right?
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
And part of that, the image that she had of herself, she thought that, I guess, wearing heels was trivial, and she enjoyed the beginning of summer. And she enjoyed the beginning of summer because women started to wear heels again.
Yeah.
They were starting to get used to heels again, and which meant that they would fall down. And she enjoyed that because she thought that they were stupid for wearing heels and that they deserved it. Which I didn't even know where to begin with that. That's so
Yeah, it's complicated, and I think a lot of people who might be listening to this or might read the book will have had that thought themselves, or will have known someone that had that thought or has had that sentiment expressed towards them. I think it's pretty common, even among women, to have this idea. Because, like, as we already said, they're not the most practical shoe. People can argue that it's perfectly easy to walk in a reasonable, quote unquote, reasonable pair of high heels that aren't like 8 inches tall and all that kind of stuff. But there's this idea that to wear high heels, you're like capitulating to men, or that you're doing it for the male gaze, or that you're giving into some kind of harmful beauty standard. And there's certainly arguments that can be made for that. But then what's interesting is then this other side where there can be a kind of, I don't know if it's schadenfreude, but just a bit of a glee of like, see, you've been foolish, and you kind of enjoying like making a superior choice in their eyes, I think. So yeah, so it's not the only person I've known who's felt that way, but I remember finding it kind of striking.
Yeah, when I was reading that, I kind of went through the catalog in my head of people that I knew, and I definitely know people who do that, right? They may not come out and say it, but you can see that there is kind of this pride in their choice not to participate in this part of our culture.
Absolutely. And I think that can manifest in response to different sort of expressions of, quote, female culture, whether it's makeup or certain kinds of clothing, or shoes like high heels. I mean, there's recently I've seen things like is it Alicia Keys that was, doing a no makeup thing, and that was like a hashtag. And I mean, the difference, of course, is that wearing makeup generally doesn't like hurt you. I mean, I guess it depends on the makeup, but most makeup doesn't cause physical pain, but high heels can cause physical pain. So I do think it is it's similar to reactions to other types of feminine decoration, but it's also a bit different because of the physical aspect.
Yeah, I guess the thing that I found bothersome was that, the association that's being made is that, something that's almost exclusively feminine, almost exclusively for women, is being associated with stupidity, right?
Well, exactly. Yeah. Yes, it's not just, oh, that's a thing I don't want to do, because of course women are rewarded for wearing them, penalized for not wearing them, and vice versa, depending on the setting. But, it's not as simple. It's rarely just about pleasing men either. I mean, it's a whole culture set up around our expectations of women and how women should look and dress that's enforced by all genders, I think, or at least by men and women. I don't know if I want to say that it's everyone's fault, but I think, especially by people buying into gender binary, definitely enforce these ideas. And so it's not just, oh, I want men to think I'm cute, so I'm going to wear high heels. There's a whole other set of professional expectations and adhering to fashion trends and what that says about your intelligence, especially if you might work in a creative field or, there's a lot going on there.
Yeah. And, I actually have a confession for you because another thing, I'm admitting a lot of things.
Go for it.
I don't think I've ever said this out loud because I didn't think about it until I read your book. I don't wear high heels, and I never have.
Yeah.
Right? And there's a good reason for that. So I'm tall, which means I have, larger feet, right? And, I became tall really quickly. I think I was a teen, and, so I reached my highest height fairly early at the time where most women or young women or teenagers are learning to walk in heels. Generally taller people have larger feet. And my mother and I, we had this ritual where we would go around to just find shoes that would fit me, that were, slightly beyond the standard size. We'd find these little stores in our small town that had shoes for, there was actually one called Tall Gals.
Nice.
And,
Yeah.
so here's the thing, you probably already know this, that most of those shoes were flat, right?
Oh, yeah, that makes sense.
Yeah, because the assumption was, and I never thought about this, because the assumption was that if you have large feet, you're probably tall. And if you're a tall woman, you don't want to be taller.
Right. Right. Well, because it's interesting. It's like it's all within these particular parameters. Like I'm not sure what that ideal height is, or people look at fashion models and their high heels and think, oh, isn't that supposed to be the ideal? But those women are like 6'3" in their in their shoes a lot of the time, and I mean, so if you've never worn high heels, I mean, I'm not crazy tall. I'm 5'9", which is on the tall side, but I don't know how tall you are. But people always think I'm taller than I am. I think like even if I'm wearing heels with just 2 inches or 1 inch, people always think I'm taller and make a comment on it, and so you end up drawing attention to yourself that doesn't always feel like very good attention. So, well, I say in the book that I think a lot of men, especially, sometimes feel sort of weirdly threatened by a tall woman, and that's the idea behind, well, why would a woman who's already very tall want high heels? Like, what? Well, that's what we'll just give her flat shoes.
Right. And it's interesting because, like I said, you opened up this part of my mind that I kind of locked away and I didn't think about very much. But,
Yeah.
since then, because I never learned to walk in high heels. And now, you can find them in, all sizes. And so I built this whole system of compensation around, expectations of femininity. And so, like I gravitate towards pointy flats because at a certain angle, they actually look like heels. Right.
Yeah.
So anyway, that's my little system that I've set up.
Yeah, no, it's interesting. I mean, there's all these expectations about what women are supposed to look like and about what our feet are supposed to look like. Particularly, it's an odd kind of focus for gendering the body in many ways. But like you mentioned, that high heels make women more vulnerable, right? And I've been thinking about this a lot. In the book, I say that there are these researchers at a British university who did tests of, women wearing different heights of high heels, and they decided that what the high heels did is they exaggerated a feminine walk. And so they called it supernormal stimuli. But of course, for something to be supernormal stimuli, there has to be a normal stimuli that it's presenting a more exaggerated version of. Examples in nature are like, so when they were first discovering this phenomena among animals in the early 20th century, for example, there were these birds that would sit on eggs. Their own eggs were light blue with gray spots. And the researchers found that if they gave the birds these like giant fake eggs that were bright blue with big black spots, the birds were like, oh my God, these are great. And they would sit on these like fake eggs and ignore their real eggs. And there's lots of examples like that where, male butterflies they found were attracted to the markings on the bodies of the female butterflies. They really didn't care about the wings at all. And so if they made these fake cardboard butterfly bodies, they didn't even need wings. The males would ignore receptive females and try to mate with like these cardboard things instead. And so that's like the idea with supernormal stimuli. And so I was thinking, well, if high heels are supernormal stimuli, what is it that they're mimicking? Because I don't know. This is an interesting sort of thought experiment. It's to think like, do quote women or feminine people walk differently than masculine people? Like really? And I don't know if that's really true. There's certainly like cultural ideas about the way a woman walks or is supposed to walk, but there's plenty of people that don't adhere to that. And so I wondered if the stimulus that was being exaggerated isn't so much like a feminine way of walking, but just the vulnerability itself, and that would be what supposedly males are finding more appealing anyway.
Wow, no, that's fascinating.
Yeah. And I mean, part of why I wanted to do this book is to just give a closer examination of these kinds of things. Like, what is femininity, and, why are some people drawn to it either to have it themselves or to, experience it in a romantic partner? Or is it culturally created, or is it something that's arising organically? And what happens when it arises in people that, culture says it shouldn't be arising in? And yeah. So it's fun to be able to look into biology and science for this too.
Yeah, that's really interesting. You've got me thinking. I'm sure there's been research on, whether women and men walk differently.
I mean, it's odd because there is a whole history of this, and I want to recommend a really great book. I'm sure many of your readers are familiar with the writer Rebecca Solnit, and she's of Men Explain Things to Me fame, and among other things. But she wrote a great book in 2000 called Wanderlust, which is about walking, and there's great sections about women and walking in that. And I referenced that book in my book, but it talks about these studies that people did about men walking versus women walking. And for a long time, there was this weird idea that women were like worse at walking than men, which kind of doesn't really make sense. I mean, and some of the arguments were like, well, it's about our pelvises or it's about this, and like none of it really holds up. And it's all based around this kind of like mid 20th century idea of like the man as provider who goes out into the world with a female that's like stationary at home, which was kind of relatively a new model of gender dynamics anyway, because of course in the past, women were much more likely to be participating in their husband's trade, whatever that is. Like if he was a butcher, she was a butcher or a butcher's assistant or whatever. And so, it's this very post-industrial revolutionary idea of, the man who goes off to procure nourishment and a woman who's at home. And so they were then reading like ancient people's lives on the basis of that. And so there is research about it, but a lot of the older stuff is pretty questionable.
Yeah. Yeah, shoes are fundamentally about mobility, right?
Absolutely.
And, improving mobility. And, thinking about how that's evolved from, long ago when men and women were equally expected to benefit from the introduction of shoes. I'm thinking like, hunting and gathering,
right,
in contrast to where we've evolved to now, where feminine footwear has moved in the complete opposite direction,
Right. I mean, and, and I think it is, somebody should probably do like, this is definitely somebody's fascinating PhD on this kind of thing. But it is interesting to see the points in history when men's and women's shoe styles diverge and then come together again. I mean, like medieval shoes, men's and women's shoes were pretty much not different. I think there was, especially in the upper classes, there was difference between the materials that were used, and queens were going to be wearing silk shoes and things like that, but there wasn't as much difference. And these are maybe arbitrary examples, but then you look at like ancient Greece, where women were sequestered and not really allowed in public unless they were prostitutes, and that's where you get the start of these kind of crazy tall platform shoes and shoes that aren't conducive for normal, comfortable walking out in the world.
Yeah. This is more of a comment than a question, but, there's a story in your book about a comment made by designer Christian Louboutin.
Yeah.
Right. And he did an interview with the fashion photographer, Garance Doré, and she asked him, why do men find high heels so attractive? And his answer was really interesting. He said, because they slow women down. And I guess that was so that men could admire them.
Yeah. And then he said this comment like, what's the hurry, basically? Like, just, slow down so I can look at you. And I was really struck by that. There was like a filmed sort of day in the life for her for a fashion week a few years ago. And it included this little interview in his apartment. And I thought that was just really striking, because this is a man designing some of the most sort of like luxurious status shoes that exist right now. And you'd think it would be about at least the way she walked, if not, the look of the foot when it's flexed like that or pointed, or what it does to the legs, or how it changes the composition of your body when you're in these high heels or whatever. No, it's just that she has to walk more slowly, which, I don't know, it's food for thought. And that's, things like that are part of what made me think of these ancient myths and these Greek myths, like I talk about, which many of them are about, slowing women down or catching women, or women that are physically running away from men or from gods. And so I saw some echoes there.
Exactly. Like the Greek myth of Daphne and Apollo that you talk about in the book. And that's actually one of my favorite analogies in the book.
Yeah. And, and this is one of the great luxuries of being able to do work in Paris. If you want to be thinking about, art history, at least Western art history, obviously, because there's so much of it everywhere. And so I got to see statues and be reminded of these myths. But the story of Daphne and Apollo, I guess Daphne's really a nymph, not so much a woman, but, allow me my liberties there. But so she's very beautiful and she doesn't want to get married. She's not interested in sex with anyone, or she just wants to be single. But the god Apollo becomes infatuated with her. I'm not going to say that he was in love with her because, but so he wants to possess her. And so he starts chasing her through the forest, but she's really fast. And so she's running away from him. And he does this very kind of funny, I think to a modern reader, at least a modern feminist reader, he sounds very much like the nice guy TM, like, I'm so great. Why won't you go out with me? Like, you have no idea who I am. I'm such a nice guy, and this whole thing. And she's just terrified and she runs away from him. So she wants to get away from him. And so she prays that she'll be changed so that she's not beautiful anymore, because she knows that he won't pursue her if she's not beautiful. And so cruelly, sort of the reverse of her wish happens. And so she loses everything but her beauty. And how this is manifested in the story is that she becomes the laurel tree. And so she gets rooted to the soil. And so then she can't run anymore, and he catches her. And I'd heard that myth, as a kid, I think, but it wasn't until I thought about it more recently that I realized it's really kind of a horror story in many ways. It's like those nightmares where you're trying to run for some reason and your feet, like you can't pick your feet up, they're too heavy. And so, so she turns into a tree and he's able to catch her and make out with the tree, basically. So that's the myth of Daphne and Apollo. But there's so many stories like that are about a woman trying to run away and the man or the male god that's after her. And so I thought about that when I heard the comment by Louis Vuitton.
Ryan Reynolds here from Mint Mobile. I don't know if you knew this, but anyone can get the same premium wireless for $15 a month plan that I've been enjoying. It's not just for celebrities. So do like I did and have one of your assistants switch you to Mint Mobile today. I'm told it's super easy to do at mintmobile.com/switch.
Upfront payment of $45 for 3-month plan, equivalent to $15 per month required. Intro rate first 3 months only, then full price plan options available. Taxes and fees extra. See full terms at mintmobile.com.
Have you ever spotted McDonald's hot, crispy fries right as they're being scooped into the carton? And time just stands still. Ba-da-ba-ba-ba.
There's so many layers there. I mean, it had so many connections to like what's happening in modern times, right? Like when women reject men, women are trying to reject or run away in a sense, and not accepting that, right? And so much there.
Right, exactly. I mean, and I felt like maybe I was a little naive. I mean, I knew there was bigger issues in this idea of this book because, of course, it's about shoes, but it's really about like women in public and women moving through the world in public. And I was still a little bit surprised how dark this got in many ways. Even just looking at some of the most obvious like iconography of shoes and high heels, like with fairy tales, with the glass slippers of Cinderella. And you look back to the original fairy tales and they're pretty dark. It is interesting to look at these ideas that we have about women and women's movement in the world through myth and through fairy tale, and how those echo to how we see it today.
And also about women trying to shrink themselves to make themselves less vulnerable, right? Or shrink their beauty, or shrink the things that are good about them or that are big about them to avoid being chased through the forest. Maybe women who have long hair, they'll hide it when they're walking down the street to make themselves less attractive. That's what it reminds me of.
Yeah, I mean, in the end, that kind of made her more vulnerable instead of less. But with women and beauty or expressions of certain kind of feminine beauty, it's always a double-edged sword, because it's like if you show up to like a gala event in like loafers and baggy jeans. I mean, I guess it depends on who you are, obviously, and like who made your baggy jeans. But you know what I mean? Like if you show up somewhere not sort of performing this type of femininity, people be like, what do you, come on. It could be seen as showing disrespect. There's all these different ways that it can be interpreted negatively. But then, walking home from an event, then if you get attacked, you can be blamed for being too sexy. So basically, it's like you're too sexy or you're not sexy enough. And it's like this sort of razor thin line between these two things that can change throughout the course of your day, depending on what you're doing.
Yeah. And then there's this punitive element too, right? Like if you think about Cinderella, that fairy tale, I heard this as a child too, right? But, when you think about it, her shoes are glass. So if she tried to escape, it would be shards of glass, right?
Right. But there's something really interesting and precarious about the use of glass slippers in the story, goes back to, I guess, the 18th century in France. The French telling of Cinderella is the version that we know best now. But as I mentioned in the book, the Cinderella story exists across all kinds of different cultures all over the world. And so the glass ones are the most recent ones. And I think it's interesting that that's the image that we find the most compelling for these like sort of maybe slightly dangerous shoes. I mean, the assumption is that they're not going to break because they're magic. but it is sort of like, why glass? Why not crystal or diamond or something? You know what I mean? Like there's something interesting about the delicacy and maybe danger of the glass that somehow appeals to our subconscious on some level.
Yeah. So you talk a lot about professional expectations, right, in your book, and you worked in the UN, and about how there is this expectation that you would, present yourself in a certain way, and high heels was, I guess, a part of that. But then you talk about the story about Samantha Power, who I love.
Right. Yeah, she's great.
And how she would sprint around in sneakers, right? But she still had confidence. I mean, what's the difference there? Can you explain that? I don't know.
I mean, there's so it's complicated, these things. And yeah, I think, I've never seen her in high heels. Once I would see her around the building. We never interacted. Like, I didn't do anything particularly important at the UN, although it was very interesting. And I got to see a lot of interesting people who are involved in international diplomacy.
Yeah. I mean, I guess I'm trying to parse through why high heels would enhance one woman's, perceived power and status, but not another. You know what I mean? I mean, what is it about our individual presentation that inspires people to project their expectations around our footwear, and what that means about us? Do you know what I mean?
Exactly. Well, also, of course, it is very subtle. And I think, there were studies done about this, because the question of what should women look like in order to be in the workplace has been a very specific, kind of interesting field of study. I mentioned this book in my book from the 70s, and they did these surveys basically trying to find out, how can we take women seriously? We can't take women seriously. Look at them. So we should change them so that we can take them seriously, which is kind of a ridiculous concept, because instead of just taking women seriously, however they are or however they already dress, there was an idea that they had to be transformed for the workplace. And this was especially true after the 1950s, 1960s. And so they did all these surveys about, women's appearance and what they needed in order to be seen as professional and competent mostly by men, by superiors and clients who were, majority male at that time. And they found that what the women needed varied woman to woman, because there was this kind of odd place of that they were trusted more and seen as more competent if they were in this sort of in-between space of feminine but not too feminine, and presenting certain masculine things in their attire but not totally. And this changed depending on what the woman looked like. So if she was a tiny little petite woman, she could take a lot more masculine accoutrements than maybe a taller, more broad-shouldered woman. And it changed by race too, which is shouldn't be actually that surprising. And so there's actually separate chapters in the book for white women and non-white women and the things that they should wear, say if they're a lawyer or a businesswoman, because it invoked different reactions. And I think that people even now might relate to that feeling, is what you have to do to telegraph this sort of safe space of presenting as feminine, but also having, not too feminine. It's the same old story again, but it's something that changes, I think, really quickly and doesn't get talked about as much, the differences in how who you are influences what you need to do to be taken seriously.
Yeah. So, what's really interesting about that is that, I spent most of my career in technology, which is, of course, male dominated.
Oh, yeah.
I spent a lot of time around engineers, and, unlike working in the UN or in a bank or in, real estate or politics, although it is an office setting, there is more room, and, maybe even there's pressure for some women to assimilate to this very dressed down presentation. Do you know what I mean?
Oh, interesting.
Sneakers and hoodies and, that very kind of Mark Zuckerberg look.
Right.
And I talked about this earlier about, how although, I'm not a fan of wearing high heels, I do have a very feminine presentation. I love to wear dresses. I love skirts. Actually, I'm always in a dress or skirt. And, in some ways that kind of made me an anomaly in that environment.
Yeah. But then, of course, there's Sheryl Sandberg, Miss Lean In, right? Whatever regardless of what you think of her, who is often photographed in very high heels, and has a very kind of old school. I mean, she's also, I guess she's Gen X. I don't know. But I mean, she's not a millennial woman. It's a different generation than, women in their 20s or early 30s right now. But she presented the more traditional power dressing for women a little bit more. But yeah, it is different. And it depends on, your workplace and your field and all kinds of different things.
Yeah. And it also, when you enter the realm of politics, it changes altogether, because you have this chapter about Hillary Clinton and her choice for shoes. And now we've got 6 women running, right? Yeah. And I'm thinking about, their choice for shoes, how much
thought and time is put into this, presenting yourself as, you can't be too sexy, you can't be too attractive, because then, people won't take you seriously.
Right.
Right. So,
right. And but also at the same time, people expect a certain level of grooming for women that they don't expect of men. And I think, most of the women running for president right now, if not all of them, wear makeup visibly in public. But I actually think it's already changing like 3 years later after 2016. Yeah. And the chapter you mentioned, I mean, it's this little sort of short pieces that are like a page or less than a page, but just so people don't think I wrote 20 pages on Hillary Clinton's shoes. But although there's a time when I might have been able to do that. But no, I said in the book that, she wore these kitten heels for the debates. And I was, in the process of researching and starting to write this book. And I thought a lot about them because I thought, well, if she did get elected to be president, the first female president, there's this company that always made the president's shoes for a long time, or often made the president's shoes. And I thought, would they be making kitten heels now? Or what would happen? But they seemed like such a specific shoe for who she was in that moment, and of trying to convey authority, but also be age appropriate, but be formal enough for the setting, but not seem not sensible. So yeah, I think it's already changing a little bit just because there's more women around. Like when you're the only woman in the room, so to speak, so much more attention is put on like every single detail. And I think we still see that a lot. It's like, this woman is smiling too much and this woman is not smiling enough. I saw an article recently that said like Kamala Harris was like too relatable or something. Like she was like too empathetic. I think it was a Politico article. And, it's just like, okay, because, often if a woman is trying to be very, or if it is just being serious, it's too serious. It's not accessible enough. It's not warm enough. But then it turns out if you are warm, then somehow that's not professional. And so that's that double standard that you kind of run into, whatever you're doing.
Yeah, I was just trying to think of the perfect outfit. For a presidential candidate, like what would it be? Would she be wearing an apron with a blazer?
Well, I know it's like all these different things, and I actually think just the presence of more than one woman, on that level, does change it up, because of course, like Kamala Harris dresses pretty differently than Elizabeth Warren, and part of that's probably due to their professional backgrounds. But they have very different, ways of dress. And I think, with male politicians, and I've said this before, I don't think I put it in the book, but there's a shorthand to the way they dress that sort of had been, at least up until now, sort of like understood. Like, first of all, they're always in a suit and tie most of the time. But then, they can take the jacket off, and just being in their shirt sleeves communicates a more like getting down to work mode, or a more everyman kind of mode. And then there's the jacket off with the sleeves rolled up, and so there's these different ways that they can, with their clothing and how they style their clothing, can communicate certain like modes, especially modes of accessibility to audiences that female politicians, and, so far we don't have any non-binary people running for president. So I'm saying men and women. Actually, maybe they are, and I don't know. So if someone hears this and this gets into it, please let me know. But to my knowledge, I don't know that there's any official candidates that are non-binary. But anyway, they don't have the same shorthand, but they kind of can communicate it in different ways. And so I think it is changing in the more we see women in these positions of power or potential power, the less scary it is on some level, and the more used to it people get.
Yeah. I was going to ask about the sex, but I won't do that because
you can ask about sex. That's fine.
Well, I don't really know what to ask except, shoes, or, I don't know. There's this link to shoes in pornography, and I don't really know when that happened or how that started, or
yeah. I mean, there's definitely like multiple dissertation length answers that people could, and I'm sure have given, about the link between shoes and pornography and shoes and sex. I mean, one of the practical reasons that shoes were in pornography in the beginning, the only real research into historical pornography that I've done was in Paris in the 1850s, 1860s. And this sort of, the joke is that as soon as they invented, kind of easy photography, the guy just sort of went, wait, I know what would be really good to take pictures of. And, just like ran down the street looking for, the closest sex workers to pull into his studio to take pictures of. I mean, whether that's like really what happened, I don't know, but it kind of almost happened like that, because pretty much as soon as there was widespread photography, there was widespread photographic pornography in Paris anyways. And and there's, these images are in the archives, and this isn't like the Victorian sort of demure stuff that people see more often. Like it's pretty hardcore, what they were doing. And the women were always wearing shoes. And some of the theories about why that was because it marked them as regular women, as opposed to like an art photo. I mean, also a lot of these pictures, it's pretty obvious they weren't art photos. Like they were doing things that you're not going to find in like a Leonardo painting, but obviously, I mean, but it has been argued that the presence of the shoes in these pictures of naked women, some of them extremely graphic and others just, naked ladies. It meant that they were real women, modern women, and in a sense, women of the streets because they've got their shoes on to be in the street. I mean, there's some kind of weird logic to that of, the shoes being for your public life and prostitutes being thought of as public women, for public consumption on some level. So so they've been around pretty much since then. And shoe fetishes are almost always, of course, there's exceptions. I'm sure there's people that like just love their Vans and have a whole thing about it. But, like fetish shoes are almost always either high heels or military shoes, which are like very extremely gendered shoes.
What?
So.
Military shoes? What have I been missing?
Well, I mean, if you like, I'm not an expert on like fetish footwear, but I mean, the most common thing you think about, of course, and the face of pornography so often, or the face or what have you, are the women, right? Most of the time. But fetish shoes are often high heels worn by different genders, but mostly women, but also like combat boots or military shoes, or, I mean, it's like I think it's the fetishization of uber masculine kind of soldier image. And I think it's less common for the shoe itself to be objectified. But if you're talking about like shoes that show up in like fetish stuff or fetish art, I think those are the most common ones. So, yeah.
Okay. Well, in closing, I wish that we would spend more time talking about the fact that, high heels hurt. They hurt.
Yeah. Yeah, they do. I mean, it's an odd space to be in this because I'm not really for high heels and I'm not really against them either. I have to admit I don't wear them as much since writing this book. I've asked myself whether that is because, there's sort of three factors that could be causing that. One is I don't have the same life that I had 4 years ago when I first conceived of this book, or 4 years ago, whatever it was. I'm not living in Manhattan most of the time. I don't work in that kind of setting anymore. And, so you dress for your life, and I'm more likely to be in like pajamas. I mean, I'm a writer, right? So, or jeans or yoga pants or whatever. And I have less reason to wear high heels. Another reason is that, I'm in my late 30s and my body hurts more than when I was in my 20s. And I think there actually just is something to that. And, you get maybe some free years of wearing high heels that aren't as painful. And I mean, if there's anyone listening that has worn them for years, they might relate, that it can get more painful over time. And then the other thing, of course, is, if writing this book and thinking about what they mean and about sort of like what's been called the consensual martyrdom of women and these painful things we decide are okay, if that has influenced it. And I'm not really sure, but I don't wear them that much anymore.
Wow.
I do still like high heels and I do wear shoes with heels on them, but they don't seem quite as innocent to me as they did maybe, 10 years ago, I think.
Yeah. Well, Summer, I am going to read your book again.
Oh.
I'm going to read it again very slowly because I really enjoyed it. It's poetic, like I said, and it I don't know, it makes you think, and it slows down your thinking and makes you contemplate all of these parts of your life. And so it's really beautiful.
Oh, thank you so much. I really appreciate it.
Well, thank you for joining me. And it's been a pleasure.
Thank you so much. It's been great talking to you.
Thank you for listening. If you enjoyed this episode, please leave a review for the Electorette on iTunes. And please subscribe wherever you listen to podcasts. And please also follow the Electorette on social media. We're on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram. And that's @Electorette. And until next time, keep up the good fight.